Welcome back to the second session of day 2 of the fall 2021 Brass Symposium. I'm Christy Cunningham, and I'm part of the Symposium Committee along with Teresa Jefferson, Penny Scott, and Angel Truesdale. We're excited you could join us for the Brass Symposium. This session is being recorded and we will make it available after the symposium. We ask that you please stay muted during the presentation, and I will be monitoring the chat for questions and we'll hold those until the end. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session, Wendy Pothier. The title of her presentation is Teaching the Information Literate Supply Chain. Wendy, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Wendy Pothier. I'm the business librarian at Business and Economics Librarian. I just got a little title change there at the University of New Hampshire. I'm also an associate professor, and I am super excited to talk to you today for a little bit about, get my timer going because I can be wordy, so I'm being aware of that. Talk to you today about teaching the information literate supply chain. Just to introduce you a little bit about myself, I have of course, an MLS that I got from Clarion University of Pennsylvania back in 2007, and was happily chugging along as a librarian for a number of years until I was working as the director of the library at Maine Maritime Academy up in Castine, Maine, where I had the opportunity to start as an adjunct professor teaching some intro to research methods in their International School of Business and Logistics, which prompted me to get a degree in International Logistics Management. And I continued teaching those courses through that and a management consulting course during my time at the Maritime Academy, after which earning that degree, which was intentional, hoping to transition my career into a specialized subject librarian role that I'm now as a business librarian. However, I really love logistics, and working at the Maritime Academy gave me a lot of insights and opportunities into the world of transportation logistics and thinking about supply chains. So the opportunity opened up for me this year to design a course in supply chain here at the University of New Hampshire. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my approach to designing this course and thinking about being a librarian and being a subject expert and melding those two worlds together. So looking forward to just sharing some thoughts with you and then hearing a bit back from you. So I hope everyone can see my screen okay. I'm going to switch back and forth. And the first thing I wanted to introduce is a quick Mentimeter. We're going to sort of back and forth interact with this a bit throughout our time. So I'm going to pull that up. And if you could, I put a link to the chat, which I think I sent privately to Angel. Sorry, Angel, let me move that to everyone. A link to the Mentimeter. If you could share a product that you have found hard to locate during the pandemic, I promise no judgment on whatever product you put in this box, but if you could share something that you have found difficult to find on a shelf in your store or get delivered to your home, we can chat about it. We talk about this a lot in my class and a lot amongst my colleagues and at our dinner table. My spouse and I frequently discuss what we can and can't find at grocery stores and how that has shifted over the last 20 months or so. So it looks like I'm right there with you on cat food, and I kept bringing that up to my class, who nobody seemed to own cats but me in the class, and they think maybe, why does this lady keep fixating on cat food? But I really struggled to get cat food for about 3 months earlier this year. But it looks like a variety of things related to meats, related to foods, related to, let's see what else. Masks, definitely. It's different kinds of foods, fresh foods, frozen foods, perishable, non-perishable items have really different supply chains, different requirements for storage and transportation, some health and beauty products, paper products. Paper products were a big thing. So thanks for sharing. And we're going to come back and forth a little bit to the Mentimeter. So I'll be switching between my slides and And some of these things definitely had a time frame during the pandemic that is still currently ongoing, just to point out, of when we could find them more accessibly than others. Like toilet paper, back in fashion, easy to find. Other times, hand sanitizer, really hard to find right now. My local pharmacy is just giving it away with a flu shot or a vaccine booster because they have an excess. So, which I thought was very, very cool. All right, so I'm going to move into my slides here. All right, so I'm teaching a course I taught a course this past semester, grades are in, course completed. I'll be teaching again in the spring, and it's called Disruption in the Supply Chain. And it's a course, to give you a little context about it, it's a course that's part of a required element for graduation, which is business and practice. And I have a link later in the slides to teach you more about our business and practice program here at the University of New Hampshire. So the course is made up of senior level students from across all majors in the business school. We do not have a major in supply chain or logistics or a designated required course in our curriculum. The course is made up of 25 students, and the focus of these business and practice courses, which students have to take 2 of to graduate, is that they get more hands-on practitioner-based learning experiences within the classroom. So one way to help enable that for me is I bring in 6 guest speakers who work across my 6 modules of the supply chain, from sourcing and demand, transportation, warehousing, inventory management, and optimization. Sometimes those positions are called control tower, but we bring in different industry professionals as voices, and then we do a lot of hands-on project work inside the class. And kind of speaking to those categories of things that you have not been able to find on your shelves, we work with 6 products. The class is divided into 6 teams. Each team is assigned a product that they take throughout the semester with them and work through these modules of the supply chain. So I let the students select from a list of about 10 to 6 that interested them most, and you can see what those are. And the deliverable for this class is we do a final presentation and a final infographic that they build over the course of the semester, gathering data and information and from the insights that they get working with the different professionals. So this course is one I designed from scratch. And as I was doing that, I developed some learning outcomes that I'll share with you. So I have 4 learning outcomes. One was to kind of gain this overview of fundamentals related to the industry. And then 2 is to have an applied knowledge about those fundamentals. And that's, through those interactions and through the hands-on activities. 3 is to develop a knowledge of supply chain professionals' use, creation, and interactions with data and information in their daily jobs. And that does sound a little bit more information literacy, but also thinking about kind of the practitioner approach of like, what kinds of software do you use in your working environment? What kind of coding do you do? What programs do you do? How does Excel fit into your daily life as a supply chain professional? What kind of data do you use for demand forecasting? So a lot of kind of what do you experience in your day-to-day life, but also, what kind of information do you rely on? How do you share it? What information do you generate? So a lot of insights from our professionals really help the students kind of think about, what they're going to experience in the workplace that might be different than the products that they work with in the classroom. And then finally, my 4th learning outcome was students expanding their professional networks through these interactions with industry professionals. So those are my 4 learning outcomes. And I, as a librarian, I was thinking about the framework. And so I've got a couple more Menti slides I'd love to pick your collective professional brains about. And one is in one word, and you'll notice my Be Honest mug, one word, how do you feel about the framework related to business information literacy? Again, this is anonymous, so whatever honest feeling you have, it helps us have a conversation with each other. And it's super, I will always remember there's radio silence. I had a stint in my life as a radio DJ, and I think my constant chatter is because I would always get reminded like to not have radio silence. So I'm very conscious of that in the classroom, my constant chatter. But here we've got, some people are mentioning a frame that maybe stands out to them. There seems to be, some frustration or maybe ambivalence towards the frames, or maybe not sure how to apply them in the scenario of business information literacy. Some people find them helpful or inspirational. Some people see them as an opportunity. And I think for me, as you're sharing your thoughts, a lot of this relates with the way that I feel about the frames. And in the past year and a half, I've been doing more work with the frames, trying to think about how I integrate them. I've read some really great literature from our professional colleagues on work that they've done. I found it inspiring. I have a few pieces to share as further reading at the end. But I've struggled. And so I thought that this might be an opportunity for me to improve as I design a course as a subject matter specialist, as opposed to in my librarian role. I have one more question sort of related to the framework is, if you could rank the frames according to the frequency you find that you can utilize them as a business librarian. And I see some chatter in the chat, which is trying to monitor all the screens. But as you maybe do a little ranking here, yeah, it would be helpful if a business librarian had been on the framework committee. And thank you, Angel. I love being a radio DJ and super, super fun. And I love Sharissa's intermission music. So thank you for doing that. And we're actually going to talk about a playlist before this session is over, because I'm a big fan of playlists. So it looks like we're starting to get some results, and I'm not surprised at the initial ranking of information has value. And there's some great professional literature that points to information has value as being one that is we find as business librarians collectively applicable to our work in instruction and information literacy. So it looks like information has value came up maybe number 1 so far. Searching is strategic exploration. Authority is constructed and contextual, which is secretly my new favorite one. Not secret, I just told you. And then research is inquiry, and information is creation as a process, and scholarship as a conversation as the last one. And actually, it's helpful for me to see this, because the way I sort of selected these to go with my learning outcomes and try to integrate them into my classroom, I try to think about them in ways that I hadn't before. And I actually use scholarship as a conversation. So I'd be curious to get some feedback of what you think about that conversation. So we'll come back with one more Menti later on. And I love Mentimeter. I use it in most of my teaching, in person and hybrid and fully online. So just a little bit here, a reminder that the framework is something they encourage us to use as a platform of conversation and a way to integrate into the curriculum. And I thought, all right, collaborating more extensively with faculty. Well, here I am. I'm a faculty. I'm teaching this course. I could collaborate with myself. That seems like the easiest collaboration ever. So I selected these 3 frames to try to correlate to my learning outcomes as I design this course. And I'm going to talk through how I map them together and examples of ways I integrated them into the classroom. And so this is sort of a lot of text on the slide, and I'll kind of break it down and move through it a little more coherently. So the first frame that I utilized was authority is constructed and contextual. And from that, I pulled out one knowledge practice, which I've shortened here to KPs, and two dispositions. So the first was the knowledge practice about different types of authority, subject expertise, societal position, special experience. Other ways I've thought about this as a business librarian were like, how the authority we grant to proprietary databases, the authority we give to entities like corporations. And I kind of tried to tie this with the learning outcomes 2 and 4, thinking about, the networking piece and the applied knowledge that I was hoping my students would develop by working with industry professionals. So one way that I could do this in the classroom was to invite diverse voices in, and that would be through the guest speakers, the guest lecturers that I chose, the podcast that I selected for students to listen to as homework assignments, and the media that I would select, and its representation of different voices within the industry. Who has authority in supply chain? It was particularly challenging in this last year because supply chain is in the news so much, and because news is it dominates, like the headline is the headline, right? It's the headlines, we call it that for a reason. And so it's really easy to get distracted by the headline and miss other voices and stories that give a more complete or complex version of the narrative related to the discipline. So a couple of ways that I tried to strategically integrate this frame into my course was to think about the voices that I elevate in the classroom. And so of my 6 speakers, for example, I brought 4 in who were in the first 5 to 8 years in their profession. So I did that to enhance that it would be more relatable to my students who are seniors, who are about to enter the workforce, so they could kind of think about how their professional authority themselves would maybe develop as they entered the workforce and as they gained new kinds of experiences, and also to think about how they might develop their career, and seeing kind of people who are in their early career working on the kind of upskilling and training and professional development opportunities they had and what kinds of positions they were in. But I also sought to elevate women's voices in the supply chain, and I did this in particular because only about 25% of the supply chain industry professionals are women. And it's even worse in subsections of supply chain like trucking, where there are 6% of the workforce are women. So one example of this is my class. We would take an article that we read or a podcast that we would listen to, and the teams would create a jam board of talking through their ideas, and then they would share that back with the class. And so here's one where we read an article about the trucker shortage and women entering an industry, and was that industry prepared to support women? And so they pulled out it was almost like a mini SWOT analysis of what they observed in that article, and were able to glean these points, but it also represented voices that maybe aren't heard as much in the profession. So that was one example. Also love Google Jamboard, super fun to use in the class. We also talked about, the awareness of bias in companies. A lot of podcasts in the supply chain industry are a specific company talking about their business solution to a problem, which of course has some bias to it because there's like a commercialization of that. Related to the dispositions, we talked about how to look for authority that might be manifested in unexpected ways. So with all of the news about congestion at the ports, for example, every week we'd have a standing conversation about how many ships were in the port of Los Angeles, for example, and we would talk about how do we fact check that? How do we think about that? Or how do we get more up-to-date data than what was in last week's headline? And so there's two really great tools that kind of provide data in unexpected ways. And my favorite is Marine Tracker. And this is one I used to use a lot when I was at the Maritime College. Marine Tracker is a real-time data tool showing what is happening at any port in the world. So here we've got the port of Los Angeles. I have this limited down to vessels that are cargo vessels, and this uses satellite data to talk about where they're at, and if it's available, it will tell you about the ship, where it's been most recently. So you can see, oh, that ship's been sort of hanging out in the port, and it's an amazing way to sort of fact check some of the data that we are presented, or lack of data that comes in those news headlines that are, kind of selling stories right now. And this is free, by the way. There is a paid version. Another version of it is called Vessel Tracker or Vessel Finder. So you can get more extensive information out of the paid versions, but the free versions are pretty cool. And then also we would do more Jamboard activities, like there was a sneaker shortage. So I had one team working on apparel as a product, and they tracked through several news articles from different sources and tried to make what's that complete story that is only being told out in portions based on the interest of or the spin that's given to it. So they would follow a story through and try to find that from multiple perspectives and complete their thinking on it from various voices and sources of authority. So the last disposition I had, which is questioning those traditional notions of granting authority. And for me, I really focus more on that, recognizing the value of diverse ideas and worldviews. And one way this got incorporated into our classroom was talking about the global supply chain and how it's all connected. We had to talk about things like global vaccination rates when we would talk about port or manufacturing closures or delays, and how regulation and norms in the US aren't the same across the globe, and helping people be aware of what outbreaks are happening in different places, and that regulations for work and work environments in other countries. And it also helped us think about things like sustainability and labor, sustainability in the supply chain, and fair trade. So I found actually authority constructed and contextual it was pretty applicable to the learning outcomes in my course. I also, as many of you said, information is value, I thought is a really important one. It's one I've been in my regular information literacy teaching, one I think is really valuable. And the knowledge practice of recognized access or lack of access to information. And in my class, we approached that, as teaching the content, we talked about sometimes a little bit about things like paywalls and subscriptions. And we use like IBIS World, for example, in the class. They have a great, on their about page, they have a great snapshot of a supply chain for an industry. And so that was one way, we could have a nice visualization about the supply chain related to their product. But of course, talked about how do we have access to this? When do you have access to this? Who has access to this? But we also talked about the company's access to information and how information is a commodity in the supply chain. One of our guest speakers was an import coordinator, and a major role of that work is tracking the container that they helped purchase, that has the purchased goods, and tracking that container from port to warehouse. And so some companies have the ability to work with a third-party logistics who can manage their information and manage the collection of data about where their the movements are in the transport line, and also things like when things are clearing customs. And some companies cannot afford that. And so, and we talked about the disparity between the abilities for small businesses versus mid-size or large businesses to be able to harness the power of information to control their supply chains. Also in the information as value, tied into one of my learning outcomes was this idea that trying to create more hands-on activities that help students become content creators instead of content consumers. So we've been doing these Jamboard activities, which ultimately led to this final infographic project. So students had a chance to experience kind of creation of storytelling through all of these news and data and interviews and guest lectures, starting to pull all that data together, think about ways they could shape it into a story. And that ultimately led to their final project. My third way to integrate the framework into my course was to think about scholarship as a conversation. And I used two dispositions from this. And one was this idea of entering the ongoing conversation, and that it's not a finished conversation. And I struggled with this frame the most. But we often would talk about, we're in a pandemic, we're in a shift, we're in demand shifts in the industry. We're in a time where we don't know what kind of technological solutions are going to come out on top to optimize the supply chains. We're waiting on some development of things like blockchain. We're waiting on development of maybe different manufacturing facilities and maybe some government regulations that play into all this. So we would talk about that kind of ongoing thing. And one example of that is we talk a lot about just in time, and just in time is like a revered theory in the supply chain world, but has come under a lot of scrutiny. And so we would talk about and read about different approaches to why just in time was a success in the past, and why it may or may not be the correct conversation going forward. So again, utilizing all these different voices, as I talked about under the authority, to help us think about how we would have these ongoing conversations. And I see a comment, I agree, I often just use the term professional, but I find that you shouldn't have to make those leaps all the time. There should be language written into standards in our profession that enable conversations a little more easily. And finally, my last one was just that scholarly conversations take place in various environments. So we talked about, for example, the importance of networking in business and the conversations that happen informally as having great value. And that was exampled through our classroom relationships with these guest speakers, but also looking at professional organizations, the white papers that get produced, what kind of conferences occur, what voices are elevated at those conferences, what kind of influence those professional organizations have on these subsections of the supply chain industry. So that was my approach to how I could integrate the frames into the design of a course. Trying to wear my librarian hat a little bit as I was wearing my supply chain management hat. I wanted to share a few of my students' final projects. These are their infographics. I've redacted their names so that they are unidentifiable, but how they worked, they took things from that Jamboard, or sometimes we would have, poster board paper, or sometimes we work on the whiteboard, collecting all this information throughout the 15 weeks. And their final project and presentation could then pull on these relevant conversations within their product. And I would show you more, but I could only fit a few on the screen. So I know I'm getting down there on time, I think. So I wanted to transition a little bit the conversation into what I felt were the challenges in this experiment. For me, as we mentioned a little bit in the chat, and I said, I find the framework's language really challenging. And I think challenging when I talk to business faculty about the work that they're doing, particularly in these practitioner-based courses, that it's it doesn't match. And so I have to think of other ways to phrase it. And it would be nice if my industry already thought of ways that I could phrase it differently. So then I struggled then to make the frames fit the content. And then keeping that focus on a practitioner or professional space that when the language often refers to a scholarly context. So those were some of the challenges that I felt. And I thought it would be great to hear from you before I tell you like what I think I learned from this, is maybe just going back to that mentee, if you could tell me, sorry, so many buttons on so many screens. Is there an effective way you found to bring that comp frame into the conversation with the faculty that you work with? And then I'll share with you some of mine, and maybe some of them overlap. I kind of have some ideas about the future. And maybe you don't have an effective way. You can tell me your frustrated way too. Ineffective way. So I'm gonna just kind of share as they pop up. Again, my constant chatter. Lots of folks saying I don't bring them up. They don't seem relevant. Maybe no interest. Sometimes just looking at one or two frames or a few frames. Integrate them first and then tell them. Somebody here shared an article they wrote with a colleague. So maybe you could throw that link in the chat. Would be cool if you're comfortable sharing. I see Steve put in the chat, the business research competencies are another model to use, and they're not our foundational information literacy standard for the profession, but they are more adapt to speaking directly to, maybe the practice of business. I know they are adopted. I'm just saying, I take a little offense at the frames focus without maybe the considerations of the disciplines. And then a lot of people maybe also don't feel, or some people don't feel there's enough time to adjust the frames. And I struggle with that too, because I'm often teaching one shot to a very specific assignment. So thank you for sharing those. And a lot of people want demos, and the one shots are hugely challenging. So I think for me, some of the takeaways I've had is that I want to focus less on the language and try to think more of my practical applications, because I struggle so much with the language, and I want to let the language of the frames interfere less in my thinking. And I know about over time, but I'm going to just wrap this up in about 3 minutes, and then we'll move on to kind of a Q&A. But in ways I've thought about it is, those learning outcomes that a faculty has for their course might be a helpful way to think about connection points to the frames, because also I don't want to limit the frames to that one-shot session that I have with the students in the classroom, or sometimes I don't have the opportunity even to do that one shot, but maybe there's ways I can connect to faculty on their learning outcomes. And I found that I need to provide probably more specific subject matter examples, because the subject matter is the faculty's primary focus. And that was really clear to me. Like, I didn't want to try to make the standards fit into the content of this course. I needed to teach the content of the course. I needed students to understand supply and demand. And if I could do that and also maybe, reflect some different voices of authority, I was going to do that. But first, I really needed them to understand these foundational learning about the subject matter. I've also found, I didn't use a textbook for this course, and many of my colleagues are moving away from the textbook approach, and that might give us more opportunities to talk about how some of the frames could integrate into the development of their course materials, what voices they choose to represent in the classroom, what voices they elevate. And I also think as we increase in higher ed and in our profession as librarians, conversations about inclusion and diversity and equity and accessibility. Some of that really comes out in the framework and might be a way to initiate those conversations as well. So those were some of my thinking about the future. Also, just to wrap up, I've got a few resources. I've got 3 recommended readings that have helped me as a librarian, both in thinking about how I would design this course as a subject specialist and how my information literacy might work in with it, but also just thinking in general about integration of information literacy, business information literacy, and the framework, and a little bit also about critical business information literacy. So these link out to those articles that you can, I think they're all the open access versions. And then I have a little information here about our business and practice program. If you're curious, it's a really neat new developing program that UNH has done. And finally, I wanted you to have a takeaway. I love supply chain. If I could have just talked about supply chain for 40 minutes, I would. I was trying to keep it really focused to how I made the framework work with my learning outcomes in a supply chain course. But I know we're all dealing with more supply chain questions than before because of its presence in our life and in the news and in conversations in business. So this is not a comprehensive collection of supply chain resources, but more about thinking about those voices that contribute to the conversations. Thank you, Steve, for throwing that in the chat. So over here, I have a few podcasts. The first one is Let's Talk Supply Chain, which is hosted by a wonderful woman, Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. And every week she highlights diverse and underrepresented voices within supply chain industry. And it's a wonderful weekly podcast that really elevates a lot of women's voices in the profession, as well as other folks. And then some of these other supply chain podcasts, one is from the CSCMP, which is the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals. So like an organization, as opposed to, there's a lot of podcasts that are a lot of companies highlighting their product. And I try to pick out some podcasts to share with you to learn more about supply chain or to use as a resource that focus more on like panels and professionals and researchers and less on kind of company highlighting. The middle section here is just a bunch of videos that I found useful in helping illustrate visuals to my students, thinking about things like automation, blockchain, warehousing, and shipping, but again, trying to not rely on a specific company's biased approach in presenting them. So they're more from like a third-party perspective. And then I've got links down here, a few infographics. I love infographics, and I try to use those a lot with my students because they are going to create infographics. So try to teach them so I could model what I wanted them to do. But I've got that marine traffic and that vessel finder tool linked there. And then on the second tab, more importantly, on the first tab up here, my class and I every week, we would add songs to our playlist based on what we were studying. So we've got this cool background music for you, supply chain and logistics Spotify playlist that features songs about transportation and warehousing and inventory and all sorts of goodies in there. I hope you'll enjoy it. And then we've got just a little bit about some of those professional organizations. So different sets of voices that aren't specific, and to like a business, because a lot of the conversation is companies pushing their product solutions for supply chain. And then a few academic or kind of trade pub news resources, and then a few articles that talk about diversity in supply chain and logistics. So again, kind of thinking about how we elevate different voices in the within this industry. And I'll just one quick note before I open up to questions. If you Google or search for diversity in supply chains, you'll also get a lot of information about how to diversify your sourcing in supply chains, which is more about having different product suppliers and less about having a diverse and inclusive workforce. So I would love to hear your thoughts and comments.
Thank you, Wendy. I do have one question from the chat earlier, and you've seen it. How would you translate this into a one-shot within a supply chain course, either low level for all business majors or high level, just supply chain majors?
Well, I mean, I couldn't take a semester-long course and make it into supply chain, but a one shot. I mean, this was a 15-week course, but I guess I like to make sure that there's an assignment I'm teaching to. So first, if there's an assignment, I would teach to that. And if not, I would probably talk about how I would probably approach different types of sources that aren't just the news media to do research around supply chain. So I'd probably introduce like IBIS World, I would probably introduce Statista, I would probably, things I know I have subscriptions to at my institution. I have used, different trade publications, maybe scholarly journals. And so just talking about the types of authority that have a voice in this industry, as opposed to, because of the prevalence of news stories, which aren't always presented by supply chain professionals or researchers in that field or well-known practitioners, making sure we don't rely too much on headlines when the headline is predominant. So I think that's one approach I would take to a one-shot. Great question.
Okay, we just got another one. Have you ever presented at conferences for supply chain educators?
I have not, but I would be interested in doing that. I did just write a case study with a few colleagues, which I think will be out in Sage Business Cases in early 2022 about as a case study of supply chains in the fashion industry. So I am really interested in kind of conflating my two worlds of information and supply chain, but yeah, this was sort of my first foray into getting to teach in this area. I'll be teaching again next semester, as well as I just signed up to, I'm a faculty sponsor for an MBA student who's doing an independent study in supply chain in the spring. So I think that this might become more of my, get more time and traction in my life. I'm excited to see where it can go. Any other questions?
And you're welcome to unmute.
Yeah, I'll say somebody mentioned Jamboard. I love using Jamboard. It's helpful. I started using it when we were remotely teaching because it was a great way to kind of do group work and have a visual that people could share back and talk about. And I use it for concept mapping and my honors thesis students classes. They concept map out their thesis ideas at the beginning as they're working through that. But it was really helpful way to create these stories and little storyboards that helped them think about the work that they were doing. And then they had that to refer back to as they were developing their infographic, like, oh, in module 2, we talked about this component of demand. We talked about how demand affected this industry. And then they could come back to it later and be able to remember that data, remember what that story was, and then maybe pull a piece of that out and to create their infographic. So it has like I don't know, students just jump right in and get using it. I don't even have to explain how oh, there's all these features. They know it better than I expect.
There's another question
in
the chat. Any inclusion of data visualization or media literacy for the students' creation of the infographics?
We not so much data in, not a ton. It didn't fit in time-wise. Again, we meet once a week, so it's a little bit challenging. Once a week for 80 minutes. It's a 2-credit course. But I did allow the students to pick whatever format they wanted to use to create the infographic, and I offered them some training in how to use the different free products. They all seemed very comfortable and experienced. There's quite a few assignments in the business school where they do projects that are similar to this, but I didn't really have the time, this is where I started appreciating my colleagues were like, I don't have time to bring you into my class for a one shot. Because I was like, oh, it's really hard to fit all this content in and get all the teaching done. And so it'd be interesting to think about ways I could incorporate that in and try to make it fit into the teaching of the subject matter too. And that's what I really tried to do with the frames, was not to separate them out, not have it feel different, but to have it feel like they were learning the content and somehow the frame aligned with that. Which made me think like, oh, I need to work with faculty in a different way. Like, because the one shots, they're not always working for me. I don't know if they're always working for students. I don't get to see their work later. I don't know how well they applied it. But here I had a chance to see, like, from start to finish, you know, I knew where they were when they started at week 1 and I saw where they ended at week 15. And that shifted a lot in my brain about instruction and information literacy.
Okay, I think we're right at time. So if there are no other questions, I believe we'll break until